If you were a boy in this country in the 1950s, there was a catalogue that arrived in autumn and got read until the cover came away from the staples. You circled things in it. You argued about which locomotive was the better one with a friend who had also circled things in his. You knew the numbers of models you had no realistic prospect of ever owning. At the top of the list, always, was a Hornby Dublo set, and at the back of your mind was the arithmetic of what your father earned and what the box cost. Every one of those toys was made in one building in Liverpool. 2,000 people at the busiest times. The finest model railways and the finest die-cast vehicles produced anywhere in the world, on 5 acres bought outright in 1914. That building does not exist. Not closed, not converted. Gone, cleared to the ground, the site given over to houses, with nothing on the road to tell you what stood there. But the toys are still here. That is not a figure of speech. Somewhere in this country tonight, in a loft or a spare room, a clockwork locomotive made in Liverpool before the coronation is still running. Chipped paint, a dent in one corner from the day it came off the table. Wind the key, set it on the rails, and it goes. And here is the part that took me a long time to accept. Those two facts are connected. The toy survived because it was made to survive, and the company died partly for the same reason. Frank Hornby built things that would outlast the children who played with them, and he was right, and it ruined the company in the end. That is not the whole reason 950 people barricaded themselves inside that factory on a Friday afternoon in November and stayed there through the coldest weeks of the year. To understand why they did that, you have to go back to a bookkeeper who could not afford £5. In 1899, a man in his mid-30s was working as a bookkeeper for a meat importer in Liverpool. His name was Frank Hornby. He had left school at 16. He had no engineering training of any kind. He had a wife, 3 children, and a small wage. And in the evenings he made toys for his sons out of sheet metal cut in a workshop at home. What he arrived at was an idea rather than a toy. Strips of metal, perforated at regular intervals, with nuts and bolts to join them. The holes were the invention. Because every strip could bolt to every other strip, a boy did not build one model. He built one model, took it apart, and built another. The system was the product. By the end of 1900, he was confident enough to want it protected, and this is where the story of the greatest toy empire in British history nearly stops before it starts. The patent fee was £5. Hornby did not have £5. He had to go to his employer, David Elliott, and ask to borrow it. Think about what that conversation required. A bookkeeper explaining to the man who signed his wages that he had been making toys in his spare time, and that he needed money he could not raise himself to protect an idea nobody had asked for. Elliott lent him the £5. The patent was filed on the 9th of January, 1901, under a title that gives away exactly how Hornby saw what he had made. Improvements in toy or educational devices for children and young people. Educational. That word is doing a great deal of work, and it will matter later. The first sets went on sale in 1902 under the name Mechanics Made Easy, at 7 shillings and 6pence. 16 parts, and a leaflet showing a dozen models a child could build. They sold slowly. The parts were made by other firms scattered around Liverpool, and the finish was poor. The enterprise did not turn a profit until 1906. Then it turned, and it did not stop turning for 50 years. In 1907, Hornby registered a new trademark, a word thought to come from the phrase make and know, Meccano. In 1908, he formed Meccano Limited, and his old employer retired from the partnership. The man who had lent him £5 had been an excellent investor, and he never knew quite how excellent. By 1914, the demand had outgrown every workshop Hornby could rent. So he bought 5 acres in the Old Swan district of Liverpool and built a factory to his own specification. Not leased. Owned. It opened in September 1914 on Binns Road. And for the next 65 years, that address meant one thing to anyone in the British toy trade. Walk into Binns Road in the 1930s, and the smell reaches you before anything else. Hot metal, paint and thinners, the particular sweetish tang of molten zinc alloy. Then the noise arrives, presses and die-casting machines working in a rhythm that never quite lines up, and underneath it the sound of several hundred people talking over the top of it. Rows of women at benches, hand-painting details onto carriage sides with a brush and a steady wrist. Work that no machine in 1935 could do, and no machine would do for another 40 years. Depending on the season, between 1,000 and 2,000 people worked in that building. Whole Liverpool families, fathers and daughters and cousins, generation after generation walking the same road to the same gate. The wages were reasonable, the work was steady, and the thing they were making was, by any measure, the best of its kind in the world. The trains came in 1920. Clockwork, O-gauge, built so a child could unbolt them with Meccano tools and put them back together, because Hornby assumed every boy wanted to understand the machine as much as run it. He was wrong about that, and he found out quickly. Children wanted to play trains, not build them. By the middle of the decade, he had abandoned the idea and moved to electric locomotives that ran off the household supply, fully assembled, and finished to a standard that made German imports look ordinary. In 1937 came the model of the Princess Elizabeth, 6201, named for the locomotive that had run non-stop from London to Glasgow the previous winter. It cost over £5, it came in a wooden presentation case, and Meccano offered credit terms to families who wanted it and could not put their hands on the money. It remains one of the finest things the British toy industry ever produced. If you had a Meccano set as a boy, or if the engineering you learnt from one ended up paying your mortgage 40 years later, tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone, and the stories that come back from these videos are frequently better than the research. And if you want more of these, subscribe, because there is a great deal of this history that nobody is writing down. Now, the accident. In December 1933, Meccano launched a range of crude die-cast figures and vehicles to stand beside the railway. Station staff, animals, a tractor. They were called modelled miniatures, and they were not the point. They were scenery, sold to make a train layout look inhabited. Children ignored the trains and bought the vans. It happened fast enough that the company had to rename the range on the move. In April 1934, Meccano magazine christened them Dinky Toys. By August 1935, the Meccano prefix was dropped entirely. An afterthought designed to decorate a platform had become one of the most collected toy brands in the history of the world, and it had happened almost against the wishes of the man who owned it. In 1938 came Hornby 00 scale, smaller and finer than anything on the market, and with it the sense that this company could do absolutely anything it chose. Frank Hornby by then was a millionaire with a mansion at Margate and a chauffeur to take him to the factory. He had been elected Conservative Member of Parliament for the Liverpool constituency of Everton in October 1931, which is a detail I find quietly astonishing. Running the largest toy empire on earth was the day job. Parliament was the hobby. He resigned the seat before the general election of 1935. On the 21st of September 1936, at the age of 73, he died of a heart condition complicated by diabetes, and he was buried at Margate, a few miles from the factory he had built. The chairmanship passed to his elder son, Roland. Let me be fair to Roland Hornby, because it is easy not to be. He was not a fool, and he did not wreck the company overnight. He rode the post-war boom competently for the better part of 2 decades. The trouble is that he had inherited a business whose entire advantage rested on one man's obsession with how things were made, and competence is not obsession. Roland looked at injection-molded plastic, which was arriving in the 1950s and would define the next half-century of toy manufacturing, and decided it was cheap, inferior, and temporary. He would not automate the assembly benches. He would not buy the moulding technology. Binns Road went on doing what Binns Road had always done, casting zinc alloy on heavy machinery, finishing by hand, in a city with a strongly organized workforce and rising wages. Then 2 attacks arrived from opposite directions at once. The first came from a factory in East London. Lesney Products launched Matchbox, small die-cast cars in boxes designed to look like matchboxes, sold not in hobby shops but in newsagents and sweet shops. The economics were brutally simple. A Matchbox car cost roughly 1/3 of the price of a Dinky. Put yourself on the other side of that counter with a shilling in your pocket. You can save for 3 weeks and buy 1 Dinky, beautifully made, boxed, the sort of thing your mother will put on a shelf. Or you can walk out this afternoon with 3 cars and play with all of them before tea. Dinky did not lose the argument on quality. It lost the argument on Saturday. The second attack came from Japan. Yonezawa launched the Diapet range in 1965. Tomy launched Tomica in 1970, with doors that shut with a click so satisfying that British toolmakers took it personally. Precision engineering at prices Liverpool could not approach. Dinky's answer was to add features. Opening doors, steerable wheels, suspension. Good products, all of them, and completely beside the point. You cannot out-detail your way out of a price war. By 1964, Meccano Limited was in serious financial trouble, despite exports worth more than £1 million a year. In February of that year, it was bought by its largest domestic rival, Lines Brothers, the parent company of Tri-Ang. This is the moment the story changes shape, and most accounts skate over it. Lines Brothers did not want Meccano's manufacturing. They wanted the name. The metal Hornby Dublo trains were expensive to make and competed with Tri-Ang's cheaper plastic system, so the Dublo tooling was sold off to another firm and the range was killed. What survived was the word. The Hornby name was lifted off the Liverpool product and applied to Tri-Ang's plastic trains, made in a factory at Margate in Kent that Lines Brothers had built in 1953. The combined range went out as Tri-Ang Hornby. The last members of the Hornby family were removed from the board, so by the middle of the 1960s, the most trusted name in British model railways is being printed on trains from a factory Frank Hornby never saw, in a county he had no connection to, made from a material he refused to use. Nobody lied to the public. Nobody had to. The name did the work. Then in 1971, Lines Brothers collapsed, and the empire was cut in 2 along a line that decided everything that followed. The Margate operation and the Hornby name were sold to Dunby Convex Marks, becoming Hornby Railways from the 1st of January 1972. Meccano and Dinky, the original business, the actual factory, the 5 acres at Old Swan, went to Airfix. One half took the name south and lived. The other half kept the building and the people and the machines and had 8 years left. Through the 1970s, Airfix poured money into Binns Road and watched it disappear. Inflation. The oil shock of 1973. A dispute-prone industrial climate across the whole country. Attempts to install new machinery ran into the obvious problem that new machinery meant fewer jobs in a plant where everybody already knew what was coming. By the autumn of 1979, Airfix had absorbed something in the region of £5 million of losses at Liverpool over 3.5 years, with roughly £1 million of that in the current year alone. On Friday the 30th of November, 1979, in the late afternoon, local management came out of a meeting with instructions from London. The managing director, Ray McNeice, made the announcement to the factory. The money had run out. That was the whole of it. They had hoped for more from Airfix, and by 3 o'clock the previous afternoon they had known it was not coming. Approximately 950 people, most of them women, were handed their tax forms and their redundancy letters and told to clear their lockers. The notice period, by the accounts of those who were there, was about 15 minutes. I want to sit with that figure rather than move past it. 15 minutes. Women who had worked in that building for 30 years, whose mothers had worked in it, who had met their husbands in it, were given a quarter of an hour to gather what belonged to them and walk out of the middle of their own lives. Not a consultation, not a phased closure, not the statutory 90 days that the law required. The failure was raised in the House of Commons within days by the city's own members of Parliament, and the company was warned publicly that it could face prosecution over it. Airfix replied that special circumstances applied. 15 minutes to leave a place you had given your working life to. They did not leave. Led by their shop stewards, the workforce did something that the men in London had plainly never modelled. They escorted management off the premises, chained the gates, and took possession of the factory. On the 6th of December, the occupation became a work-in. They ran the machines. They produced sample batches of Meccano parts and Dinky Toys and put them in front of anyone who might buy the plant to prove that the building was not dead, that the skills were still in the room, that this was a going concern being written off rather than a corpse being buried. No buyer came. Then the winter arrived properly. Binns Road was an enormous industrial building designed to be heated by the machines running inside it, and management cut the supply, betting that cold and darkness would do what negotiation had not. The occupiers brought in paraffin heaters and torches and sat it out, in the dark, in a factory the size of a small town, through the shortest days of the year. The country noticed. Television crews came. Questions were asked in the Commons. Dockers on the Mersey discussed refusing to handle Airfix products. Money and food arrived from other workplaces. For a few weeks in that winter, a toy factory in Liverpool became the place where the whole argument about British manufacturing was being conducted in public. Airfix simply waited. This is the part that I keep returning to, because it is the coldest strategic decision in the story. The company did not need to win an argument. It needed the occupiers to run out of money before it did. Every week that passed, the wages did not come, the bills did, and mass meetings that had rejected settlement offers began, one household at a time, to fracture. People left because their children needed shoes. That is not a failure of solidarity. That is arithmetic. By late February, the several hundred had become a hard core of perhaps 50 or 100. They knew by then that no buyer existed and that the factory would never reopen. They stayed anyway because they had decided that if it was going to end, it was going to end where people could see it. If you had family who went through something like this, in Liverpool or anywhere else, put it below. This channel exists partly to keep this material from disappearing, and the comment section under these videos has become an archive in its own right. And if you have not subscribed, do, because there is a great deal more of this. On the 11th of March 1980, in the small hours of the morning, bailiffs supported by around 30 police officers forced their way into the Binns Road factory and removed the last occupiers. The occupation had lasted 14 weeks. Now, the other half of the family, the half that had taken the name South. Dunby Convex Marks went into liquidation in 1980. Hornby emerged from it as Hornby Hobbies, rescued the following year by a management buyout, and floated on the stock market in October 1986. For a while it worked. The problem was that the underlying arithmetic had not changed at all. In the early 1990s, rivals began selling British outline models made in China at the same price as Hornby's, and the quality was demonstrably better. In 1995, Hornby closed the Margate factory floor and moved production to Guangdong. The transfer took 4 years to complete. The British workforce went from around 550 people to about 110. The models got better. That is the uncomfortable finding, and I am not going to hide it. The Chinese-built locomotives that came back were more finely detailed than anything Margate had produced, and within 5 years Hornby was strong enough to buy up rivals who had not moved in time, and later to pick up Airfix and Humbrol out of administration for £2.6 million. But the company had become something different in kind. It no longer made anything. It designed, it branded, it marketed, and it bought containers of finished product from a factory it did not own. and then the buildings went too. Distribution left Margate for Hersden in 2014. The offices went to Sandwich in 2015. In February 2017, the Margate site itself, the factory that had carried the Hornby name since the Liverpool one closed, was sold for £2.25 million. Here is what it is now. The old Hornby Works at Margate is a locomotive store. It belongs to a company that houses and restores full-size steam engines and historic carriages, and there are tracks laid through the floor of the warehouse where the model railway lines once ran. An A4 Pacific sits in there. Real ones, in the building that made the small ones. I do not think I have come across a neater image in any of these stories. The factory that spent 60 years making Britain miniature is now a shed for the originals, because the originals are the part that could not be manufactured abroad. There is a footnote to the Liverpool half of the story that belongs here. Dinky was sold on after Binns Road closed, passed through several owners, and ended up eventually under the same American parent as Matchbox, the brand whose cheaper cars had taken its market apart in the 1960s. The name still surfaces occasionally on a box. Nothing else of it survived. Two more things happened, both of them after the point where most tellings of this story stop. The first is Meccano. The brand had drifted through French and then Canadian ownership, and by the 2010s it was made at a plant in Calais that had been building it since 1959. In February 2023, the owners announced that the Calais plant would close by the start of 2024, with the loss of around 50 jobs, saying that it had never broken, even despite €7 million of investment, and that raw material costs had finished the argument. That was the last factory in the world dedicated to making Meccano. There is no other. Sets are still produced by contract manufacturers scattered across 3 continents, but the thing that Frank Hornby borrowed £5 to protect has not had a home of its own since. The second is Hornby itself. On the 10th of April 2025, after 39 years, the company cancelled its shares from the stock market and re-registered as a private limited company. The reasoning was not dramatic. 2 shareholders between them held around 91% of the business, and a listing that costs several £100,000 a year serves very little purpose when almost nobody else owns any of it. The company employs a couple of hundred people. It had been loss-making for years, and it is now controlled by an investment firm and by the group behind Sports Direct. The name is 125 years old, and it is still on the boxes. It is worth being clear that this is not a death. Hornby exists. It announced 150 new models in January, and the products are astonishingly good. What ended is something more specific and harder to put in a headline. Somewhere between Liverpool in 1979 and Calais in 2024, every single building that ever made these things stopped making them. And the toys are still here. That is the part that refuses to sit quietly. A pre-war Dinky delivery van, one of the promotional ones, sold at auction for £20,000. A trade box holding 6 of them made £35,000. These were 4-shilling toys. They were meant to be run into skirting boards by 7-year-olds and thrown out with the rest of the nursery. They were not thrown out because they will not break. A Meccano set from 1951 is a Meccano set now. The nuts still fit the bolts. A Dublo locomotive from 1956 will pull a train tonight if you put it on the track. Men in their 70s and 80s across this country are running equipment that has outlived the company, the factory, the city's manufacturing base, and in many cases the man who bought it for them. Frank Hornby's philosophy was that a toy should teach a child how a machine works and should survive being taught with. He achieved it completely. And a product that never wears out and never needs replacing is, in cold commercial terms, close to the worst possible business to be in. He built an heirloom industry, and heirlooms only sell once. That is not the reason the factory closed. The reason the factory closed is a chain of decisions taken by men who bought a name and then discovered they had also bought a workforce, a building, and a way of making things that did not fit the world after 1960. But it is the reason we are still talking about it. The evidence is in people's lofts. Stand where Binns Road was, in Old Swan, on an ordinary weekday. Housing, traffic, nothing marking it. Close your eyes. Hear the presses coming up to speed at the start of a shift. Smell paint and thinners and hot zinc. Hear 1,000 Liverpool voices under the noise of the machines and the brushes going along a line of carriage sides and somebody laughing at the far end of the bench. Picture a woman coming through the gate on a Friday afternoon in November 1979, 31 years in that building, expecting nothing more than the end of the week. Picture her being told she has 15 minutes. Picture her deciding, along with 900 others, that she is not going anywhere. Picture the same room in January, dark, freezing, a paraffin heater between 4 people who have not been paid since November and who are still there. Open your eyes. Houses. Silence. A road you would drive down without a second thought. We did not lose Meccano because children stopped wanting it. We lost it because a company that made things too well was sold to people who wanted the name, then sold again to people who could not afford the building. And by the time anyone in London worked out what was actually being liquidated, the only ones fighting for it were the women inside it. So tell me what you remember. The set under the tree, the shop you bought it from, the relative who worked at Binns Road or at Margate, the box that is still in your loft. Put it below, with the year if you can. And subscribe, because we are building an archive here of what this country made and what it cost to lose it. And there is a great deal still to get down.